there should be no reason why we should spend our time pontificating about it. But here we won't do that. We will really bring on experts. We'll bring on the relevant stakeholders. We'll bring on the relevant authorities if we need to ask them tough questions about their actions, about their inaction, about some of the decisions they make. And that's what it will be about. It will be a show where we ask those sorts of questions. This show is a bit of a hybrid show. So if you're watching us on YouTube on the SAFM channel, welcome. Please do actually watch us. If you can't listen to us on the radio, obviously that's between 104 and 107 FM. You can watch us on the YouTube channel, the SAFM YouTube channel, where the show is streaming live right now. And of course, this show will be podcasted right after the fact. So if you miss anything that happens live in studio, you can always listen to it after the fact. If you want to engage us on social media as the conversation goes, it is at SAFM Radio. That's on Twitter. You can also follow me personally on Twitter. It is at Oliver_speaking. If you want to follow me on Facebook, it is simply Oliver Dickson. And you can follow me on any of those channels. Coming up on the show today, two big issues I want to talk to you about. The first issue, the conviction and sentencing of Sibongile Mani raises really important questions about our sentencing jurisprudence. Everybody responded over the course of the last few days, in fact, the last few hours really, about just how, harsh they think the sentence is. They think it's not proportionate, but they also don't think it's congruent to the crime that was committed. In fact, many people are still not convinced a crime has been committed. And so to that effect, a lot of people think that a 5-year sentence is completely erroneous, harsh and should not be meted upon her. We're going to ask the question tonight. How does sentencing work in South Africa? Who determines what an appropriate sentence is? Do you, as a citizen of this country, have a say in it? The parliamentary process involved in bringing together that legislation, how does it work? What does it look like? Who's involved? But more importantly, what is a fair sentence? What does it look like? And how much discretion do judges have when sentencing? And when they flagrantly violate that discretion or become too heavy-handed with that discretion, what recourse other than the appellate system do litigants have, do convicts have, right? Because it is one thing to say, yeah, you can just appeal the case, right? But many people don't have the money and the time to appeal. It's an incredibly expensive exercise. It is not a cheap exercise. And I know a lot of people think that, everybody is appealing everything. No, it's really only the rich that are incredibly litigious in this country. Most litigants never see anything beyond the High Court, for instance, right? And so we're going to ask the question, what recourse do litigants have? And judges who flagrantly violate that discretion, how are they disciplined? There's a body and an organization meant to be disciplining them. There's been questions around the fitness of that body to discipline, and we've also the much publicized Hlope tribunal. Is that a fit body to do that? That's the question we're asking in the first segment of the show. And the second segment of the show, important conversation around the economic impact that our inaction or action or our just vague and ambiguous position as a country on the Russian invasion of Ukraine will have on our economy, beyond just, for instance, currency volatility across the world, oil price, skyrocketing across the world on the open market as a result of supply issues, because Russia is a big supplier of gas to much of Europe. And so the demand does not meet the supply at the moment. And therefore, oil is ridiculously expensive, pushing up the price of cost of living really in South Africa. Its inflationary impact is immeasurable for many people, especially the thinly squeezed, ever-evading middle class of South Africa. And so we're going to ask the question, how much further can this inaction hurt us? Cyril Ramaphosa, in an interview in Dubai with Newsroom Africa broadcaster Ayanda Nyati, Ayanda asks Cyril, the president, Mr. President, Russia's selling cheap oil. India bought some as a BRICS partner. Is that a consideration you're making? And President Ramaphosa did not rule it out. In fact, he said, I'm saying this verbatim, we'll make decisions that's in our best interest. That was the crux of his answer. And Minister of Finance Enoch Godongwana has a similar position. And Minister of Finance Enoch Godongwana and Minister Gwede Mantashe have met quite a bit over the last couple of days, and they've been discussing the intervention into our petrol price, right? Does that intervention include potentially buying cheap oil from Russia? Because it's not just about buying the oil. It can put at jeopardy the trade relations we have with, say, the European Union, who is our biggest trade partner, right? America is our third biggest trade partner in the AGOA deal. And these trade deals are so massive because they have preferential trading agreements are embedded in there, right? That makes these trade deals so important. And if the West is really, and if the global North in particular, is really harshly turning its back on Russia and its affiliates, does us considering, for instance, buying cheap oil from Russia put those trade deals at jeopardy? And that's an important question we have to ask, because if it does, then our administrators are gambling with our future. That's what's coming up on the show. And yeah, if you want to engage, again, you can tweet me at Oliver_speaking or at SAFM Radio, or you can simply, contact us on the SMS line. It is 41391. It is 41391. That's the SMS line, and we'll be able to engage with you on those platforms.
If you're active on social media and love SAFM, we hope you'll take a moment to like or follow our SAFM page on Facebook and Twitter. These are the best places to find all the guest information, conversations, and stories you love from your favorite presenters, along with regular updates from SABC News. And don't forget, you can send your questions to feedback@safm.co.za. SAFM, leading the conversation. SMS SAFM now on 41391. This week, today, Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m.
You are indeed listening to This Week Today with me, Oliver Dickson. And jumping into our first conversation this evening, my guest is Crispin Piri, spokesperson to the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. Crispin, welcome to the platform. Really appreciate your time being here.
Thank you very much for having me. And often we say good evening to our listeners, but I guess today it will be good evening to our listeners
and viewers. And joining us over Zoom is Advocate Mudidima Manya. Advocate, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it.
Yes, good evening, Oliver, and your listeners and your viewers on YouTube.
Thank you so much for that. Hopefully soon it will be viewers on television. Crispin, sentencing in South Africa, how does it work? What's the fundamental basics around sentencing that the average South African who's not legally educated might not know?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that sentencing is sort of a public ritual that's done where you have a judicial officer almost representing the community and sanctioning an individual for a wrong that they've done. But the preceding question before we get to sentencing itself, I think, should always be, what is the charge? Because once we understand what the charge is, then we can properly evaluate whether the sentence is adequate or not. So in a sense, sentencing is giving punishment to an individual for something that they've done wrong to society at large. So the judge would stand there, or the magistrate, the judicial officer rather, would represent the community and sanction someone who has done wrong to society. So in essence, a sentence is a sanction or a punishment to an individual.
But every crime category has a different sentence that's seemingly appropriate to the crime and the scale of the crime. How did we get to 25 years for murder? How did we get to, say, 15 years for rape? Who determined that?
Right. So that's a very good point. So some sentences are prescribed by the legislature. So for the very serious crimes in society, such as you've highlighted, rape, murder, these carry a life sentence. But then there's also a minimum sentence that is spelt out by the legislature, which is often 15 years, for instance, for some of these crimes. And so in most instances, depending on the scale of the crime and how it was committed, the judicial officer cannot depart from the minimum sentence that's required. But from a correctional services perspective, and maybe it's a conversation for another day, minimum sentences also have their own unintended consequences on correctional centers themselves. But correctly so to say, some sentences, and I think these are for very serious crimes, there is a minimum sentence that is prescribed by the legislature, which basically says society finds these crimes so abhorrent that we can't have a situation where someone gets convicted of 5 years for murder, for instance. So there should be a strong deterrent for one to commit such a crime, and that is then prescribed by the legislator. But for other crimes, the judiciary would then use the common law discretion, but primarily also what they would follow from what we call the stare decisis principle. So that is, if Oliver commits a crime of a specific nature, we then use that as a template for prosecuting or sentencing Crispin for a similar crime in a certain point in time. But the important principle there is similarity. So you have to compare apples with apples. You can't compare perjury with theft, for instance.
But it's seldom the case that every case before a court has exactly the same set of facts.
It is seldom the case, but generally one does find common elements. But another important thing is that when we look at our jurisdiction and our judicial system, we have the lower courts, which are the magistrates, and we have the superior courts, which are your high courts. And your lower courts would be, they're prescribed a certain elements of crimes that they can deal with. So, for instance, a crime that deals with murder is then prescribed to go to the regional court.
Right.
It cannot go to any magistrate's court, for instance. And then anything above that would then have to go to the high court. So if you're looking, for instance, at a life sentence, that could require the high court to actually look at that particular crime. If you're looking at a crime that requires one to really, really deprive the liberty of somebody, that would then be prescribed by the high court. But if we're looking at like the minimum sentence type of crimes that we're talking about, like your typical, unfortunately it's an unfortunate word to use, but your typical crimes and your most common crimes, those often end up at the regional court for sentencing.
Would it be fair to say that Sibongile Manyi's crime is not a serious crime? In the context of what you just explained.
As I understand it, and that's why I said the important question there is what is the individual charged of?
Right.
And as I understand it, I think the charge is theft.
Right.
And so the question that the presiding officer has to ask him or herself is, do the facts meet the elements of the crime? And
in that instance, I'm assuming judges have complete discretion.
They have not necessarily complete discretion. They have to meet an evidentiary burden, and the prosecuting authority has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the elements of this specific crime have been met, and that's what the judicial officer must consider. So they don't thumb suck this thing. They have to evaluate what is before them. And I mean, for instance, the elements of theft are quite clear. It would be taking something that does not belong to you. And so then the judicial officer would have to evaluate whether indeed this incident or these facts meet the elements of what theft is, or what perjury is, or if there's a case of murder, or what those are. Interestingly, I do also want to highlight that generally sentencing is a controversial exercise. And if we would recall, there was a case of a famous Olympian who had shot his girlfriend, for instance.
Yeah. Well, let's say his name, Oscar Pistorius. I don't know. Is it because he's up for parole soon and you don't want to be controversial?
But in that case, this is a matter of fact. In that case, this individual had gotten a sentence, which I think was of 6 years. And the state was like, this is inappropriate for what is required. And so that matter was appealed by the state itself to the Supreme Court of Appeal. And the Supreme Court found that sentence was inadequate for the type of crime that had been meted out. So,
Advocate Manya, I want to bring you in here. When we go through the appellate system, specifically on issues of sentencing, what questions do the court ask?
Well, the normal, to put it in simple terms, is the sanction or the sentence appropriate? And as lawyers, we would probably say it's shockingly inappropriate, which means that it is not consistent with what should have been meted out as a sentence, either based on similar cases or because certain factors may have been overlooked. But I must caution that, and I think Crispin has tried to explain this, that we must be very careful about what the entire exercise involves. And maybe I should start to where it starts so that we have a proper appreciation. The case does not start with a magistrate. Somebody goes to the police and say, a crime has been committed. The police will investigate. They will present a docket to the National Prosecuting Authority, who would evaluate what they have at that point and make a decision whether to prosecute. And if they decide to prosecute, that's when the matter will go to court. And there's a whole series of actions and procedures that are involved. The accused is entitled to get the contents of the docket because as a matter of law, the accused is entitled to know the case against him or her. So that's a whole process, and there will be the leading of evidence by the state because it is the one that must prove the case beyond reasonable doubt. And quite often, the accused would not even want to give evidence, resulting in a situation where the version or the evidence of the state remains unchallenged. But you must always bear in mind that
can I pause you there, Advocate Manya? Does that evidentiary burden matter in sentencing? It matters in arguing for guilt or innocence, but does that evidentiary burden matter to the same extent when it comes to the sentencing argument?
Yes, it is part. This is why I was trying to explain to you that this is a whole set of processes. For instance, somebody who pleads guilty in a matter stands a better chance of getting the leniency of the court, because the court will say, but this person is remorseful, he has not wasted the time of the court. And that is the part of the evidence that came about as a result of the conviction. But at sentencing stage, of course, the court will consider, in simple terms, the aggravating factors and the mitigating factors, and that is what will ultimately build up. But the fact of the conviction is not an irrelevant factor to the sentencing.
So arguments in mitigation and arguments in aggravation matter to what extent then, if it is fundamentally about the scale of the crime?
Well, let me put it this way. If somebody is found guilty of a crime where there's a prescribed minimum sentence, any debate or argument will have to be to start on the understanding that there's a minimum sentence to be imposed. So you're almost saying to the court, just give me the minimum of what is prescribed. But then there are instances where there is no minimum prescribed sentence. Now you will be able to say to the court, look, I'm trying to persuade you to give me a suspended sentence, a non-custodial sentence, for instance, or even if you give me a custodial sentence, to reduce it to the bare minimum.
Let's say, Crispin, we get to the court, right, and a judge just woke up on the wrong side of the bed, or maybe that judge's house got broken into the week before, and suddenly here's a housebreaking case in front of this judge. And this judge just goes berserk with the sentencing because he carries that pain of having lost valuables in a housebreaking he experienced quite recently. Is that an abuse of discretion?
Well, I think that judge would not be, or that magistrate would not be fit to sit on that case because, to some extent, they are prejudiced or biased by their personal situation. And that is something that actually does apply to judicial officers. Before they hear a matter, they have to really apply themselves as to whether there's a conflict that may arise. So
you're not going to put a judge on a divorce case deciding custody, for instance, if that judge recently went through a divorce. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, the facts matter, right? But I mean, if it was an acrimonious divorce or something, I think that judge would have to apply themselves as to whether they are fit to hear a particular matter. I mean, sometimes judges, because judges are from practice as well. I mean, maybe say Advocate Manyati, for instance, one day is an acting judge, and a counsel that he knows very well appears before him, and they actually once discussed a similar matter before. He may have to recuse himself. So the
just out of interest, Advocate Manya, do you often act at the bench, and has this happened?
No. And I think, let me correct a number of things that both of you are saying, which might create some problem. Firstly, there's a presumption of judges will not be biased. Now, a judge will be biased, and anybody for that matter, in a matter where they have a direct interest. Now, the fact that a judge like me has gone through a divorce does not necessarily mean that the judge will be biased when he or she presides over a divorce of Oliver. I think we should not create that type of impression. The same applies in the
well, that seems highly
judges,
speculative to me, Advocate, because we're
I'm
really
trying
just
to avoid-
speculating here that that judge won't impose their personal experience on how
No,
they decide in this instance.
I'm trying to correct that because it's a bit of a problematic proposition. It might send a message that you do not intend. The issue that I'm explaining is if a judge feels that they are not in a position to preside over a matter for one reason or the other, the judge will ordinarily recuse themselves. But you cannot say because the judge got a traffic fine, the judge will be biased towards traffic officers because the traffic officer was doing his job. So I think we need to be very careful.
But I advocate
about-
you being a little bit reductionist there, because a traffic fine is not the same as a divorce, which is also not the same as saying, experiencing an incredibly egregious housebreaking or an incredibly egregious robbery, right? Those things have a emotional impact on the psyche of anyone, any judicial officer. And the mere fact that I think judicial officers can sometimes recuse themselves is an acknowledgement that that bias is possible. I think what you're trying to convince me here of, Advocate, is that judges are never biased.
No. That's not what I'm saying. I'm actually trying to explain to you and to correct a perception that a judge would sit in a matter where they are conflicted. Now, bias relates to a matter where you are involved, not because you had an experience. That experience does not constitute bias or a basis for bias. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay. Crispin, if a litigant wants to say receives an unfair judge or what they perceive to be an unfair judgment or an unfair sentencing, they have at liberty the appellate system before them, correct?
Indeed.
What happens when they can't afford it?
Legal aid is a very accessible institution.
Talk to
in
me
this
about
country. And I mean, depending on your means and your affordability, I think legal aid would then assess which bracket you fall into, and then they would be able to assist you to access justice, because ultimately that's what legal aid is about, is to ensure that individuals who come before the courts and are unable to afford the legal system, at least they have access to very competent attorneys, and as the case may be, sometimes even advocates, where they're able to then appeal some cases and even not even just appeal cases from the get-go.
My understanding is
legally
legal aid before taking on a case will look at the merits of your case and often have to answer the question, what are the prospects of success? And if they believe very little, they may not litigate on your behalf.
The legal aid will have to look at your affordability, because remember, as an individual, you are presumed innocent, not before guilt. So I mean, if the legal aid would look at your case and say there's no way you're going to win this, then they're presuming that you are guilty.
I'm talking about the appellate system. This is not case of first instance. It's about after you were unsuccessful in the regional court and you want to approach the high court, or maybe you were unsuccessful in the high court and you want to go to the Supreme Court of Appeal. They fundamentally, because legal aid does not have infinite resources.
Correct. And I mean, they would have to look at the record and understand for themselves whether this is a case that would really yield would constitute a proper expenditure of state funds, and they would be able to review that. But I mean, even then, that's a decision that they would have to record and state that they've looked at this case and this is how they have come to a conclusion whether they are supporting or they are able to assist an individual.
Yeah. Is legal aid state funded?
Legal aid is wholly state funded. And we wish that we could get a lot more funding for legal aid. But one of the difficulties that we do have at the current moment as a state is that legal aid could get a lot more funding. But where we are currently is that...
Is Minister Lamola making that argument in Parliament?
Certainly is. And luckily our budget votes are coming up in at least May, and we'll be able to hear this argument more soundly. But that's one of the critical institutions, a critical forum for access to justice, where people deserve proper legal representation before our courts. And one of the things that we do find is that a lot of people perish because they don't have adequate legal representation.
Absolutely.
Well, not perish, but they do find themselves incarcerated, perhaps.
Yeah, and it really, really is an aberration of justice when that happens. I want to take a quick break. On the other side of this, I want to continue the conversation very briefly, and I want to ask the question, what do we do to judges who just flagrantly violate their discretion, flagrantly, impose personal views on a case? How do we discipline them? And there's an institution in the body in the country that's set up to do that, and we'll speak about that on the other side of this.
SAFM has signed a code of conduct that is enforced by the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Under the code, we are committed to giving news that is accurate, comment that is fair, and programming that is not harmful, does not amount to hate speech, or contain violence or explicit sex. If you think we are not living up to that code, then you can inform the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. Direct any complaints in writing to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa. PO Box 142365. Craig Hall 2024. Fax to 011-326-3198 or an email to bccsa@nabsa.co.za. For more information, please visit www.bccsa.co.za. The SABC News Portal is your one-stop digital platform for all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest and breaking stories. Listen to all SABC radio stations live, including podcasts, and also watch the SABC News channel with clips and live streams of all the big news events. Simply download the SABC News app on your smartphone from the Play or App Store. SABC News, independent and impartial. SAFM 104 to 107 nationwide, leading the conversation.
Oliver Dickson on SAFM.
If you're just tuned in and you're wondering, who are these people speaking? I've never heard this voice on this platform. My name is Oliver Dickson. I'm new to the platform. This is my first show here on SAFM. And I'm here to lead the conversation with This Week Today, a weekly show that will take place every Friday at 6 p.m. And I'm honored to be in your company, and I hope you will indulge us for the hour that we are here for every Friday. You are listening to This Week Today, and we're discussing at the moment how sentencing works in South Africa. Without making Zbongile Mani's case the template for which we'll look at the facts for, but rather just broadly, conceptually, how does it look like, and how do we really, what do we do to judges who flagrantly violate that sort of discretion? And Crispin, I want to go directly into that. Judges often, might misstep. They're human. We're not being judged by machines. Judges may make mistakes. Judges may walk into a chamber and say, we are trusting you, to another judge. And such a judge may need to be disciplined. What happens in that instance? How from start to end, how does that happen?
Yeah, I think we need to differentiate the conduct of a judge is spelt out in how a judicial officer carries out what is expected of them. But when it comes to decisions of judicial officers and judges in particular, one thing that we have the benefit of in this country is that their judgments have to be written. And their rationale has to be published because it's precedent creating. So
absolutely,
and there's a reason why our high courts are called the High Court of South Africa, and sitting in Johannesburg, or the High Court of South Africa in the Western Cape, sitting in Cape Town, for instance. This is because the decisions that they make have a binding effect on other courts. So if a similar matter of this nature comes before another court, we would first look at the judgment of, say, Judge Oliver Dickson, for us to understand how we go about dealing with a case of this particular nature.
Right.
So judgments have to be rationalized literally in writing, and so we're able to then look at a judgment and say, but this does not make sense. We are going to appeal it. And that's the recourse that you have as a party when a judgment you think has not met what is expected of that particular judgment, or the judge has not applied themselves adequately. And you do find instances where the superior courts, especially the Supreme Court, would be scathing about
Absolutely.
another judge's judgment.
That was a big issue at the before the Judicial Service Commission for the interviews of judges to fill vacancies in certain courts, and High Court judges were complaining. It came up that High Court judges were complaining at some judges' convention they had about how scathing and just humiliating some of these Supreme Court and judgments are, especially when it sets aside the judgment of a lower court.
But equally the case, so if you have a magistrate, and we've had an instance of this where a magistrate in KZN gave shocking judgments for an individual who had committed rape against minors, for instance. And the High Court was completely scathing. As a result, one of these magistrates is being impeached by by Parliament, because that's what the law requires. So the minister has made a recommendation. I think that one of those magistrates has subsequently been impeached. So the High Courts also do look to some extent and do review some of the judgments that come from our lower courts. And the recourse in that instance is to ensure that if a judgment is shockingly inappropriate, the High Court has to correct what has gone wrong and then realign the justice system. So in a sense, when it comes to judgments, what we do see is that there is a self-correcting system. It may not be perfect. There may be judgments that slip through the cracks, but most of the time we do see that system is self-correcting, and it does really, remember, as I said in the beginning, the judicial officer sits there almost on behalf of society to say, how do we correct what has gone wrong in society, but also how do we deter other individuals from not doing the same mistake again.
Advocate Manya, Crispin, while being a lawyer himself, it really is the spokesperson for Justice and Correctional Services, and so obviously it's in his best interest to speak well of the dexterity of the system and its ability to self-correct. But as a litigator yourself, as an advocate, as a practicing attorney, do you think that's a fair description, that the system is self-correcting?
Well, look, I think Crispin has been a spokesperson, but the sum total of what Crispin is telling you is that whatever he's saying is based on the constitutional framework which we have. For instance, the Constitution provides for the hierarchy of the courts. There is an automatic right or a right to appeal, or to have a judgment of an inferior court or a decision of the executive or whoever reviewed. There is provision on how to deal with the misconduct of judicial officers, whether in the magistracy or in the high courts. So there is indeed a built-in mechanism. You are aware that there is a matter involving the Judge President of the Western Cape, which went through the Judicial Service Commission. A decision was taken to send it to the Judicial Conduct Tribunal, which has now made a recommendation, and I think that is it has passed that stage where there are contestations about what should happen. So he is correct. It's just that he's probably putting it in a spokesperson language. But what he's telling you, he's not singing any praises. That's what the constitutional framework has created for us.
Do judges generally, and I mean, they take an oath, right? Politicians take an oath too. They go in parliament and they raise their hand and they say, "So help me God," but behave in ways that does not meet that oath. Do judges always respect that oath? And do we have judges with integrity by and large?
Yes, I think to be a judge, one of the key elements is that you would have to have integrity. I would find it difficult to believe that there's anybody sitting at the bench at the moment who lacks integrity at the point of entering the judiciary. It may as well be that in the process of being a judge, there are misconduct issues. I mean, you saw the case of Judge Nkola Mtata, who was convicted of being drunk.
For not being sober as a judge.
Yeah, and not being sober as a judge. He was already a judge, and like any other human being, he probably forgot that I am held to this higher standard. And he committed this offense. But exactly what Crispin has been saying, the law didn't say because you are a judge, we are going to treat you with kid gloves. He was arrested like any other person who committed an offense, appeared in court, he was convicted, and he could try and appeal like any other person. So that's
Yeah.
the system as it is.
Absolutely.
So in general terms, judicial officers are expected to uphold the high standard of integrity. I think generally they do. I think there would be instances where, like in any environment, a journalist would misbehave and the journalist will say it doesn't represent all of us.
Advocate Manya, thank you so much for your time. I really, really do appreciate it. Crispin Piri, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Crispin, for always making yourself available. Thanks. When we have some tough questions to ask. That was Advocate Manya and Crispin Piri, the spokesperson of the department. Yeah, go ahead.
For a Friday, it's a very heavy topic. I hope next time you'll talk about Amapiano or something.
The last time I spoke to you, Crispin, was it on Christmas Eve? Was it on New Year's Day of a year? And we spoke about the publishing of sex offenders list. That was heavier than this. Always ready for the heavy stuff. Thank you so much. We'll take a quick break. On the other side of this, we speak about the economic impact of South Africa's inaction in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What could that have? What could the ripple effect be on our economy beyond just currency volatility? We want to talk about the fact that it may, tarnish our trade relations with some of our biggest trade partners, the European Union, as well as America, the United States of America, and that AGOA deal. That's coming up on the other side of this.
We must act together as a united people for national reconciliation, for nation building.
Mandela's legacy is carried by us as a united people. Let us stand together, because together we can overcome. We have done it before, and we can certainly do it again. Hashtag we will overcome. SAFM, leading our united nation in this conversation. For unskippable, no clickbaiting, and cookie-free, with lots of real followers and likes, place your sales campaign on SAFM. Radio is still the best place to advertise your business at affordable rates. SAFM, with its national footprint and top personalities, offer advertisers distinctive opportunities to reach their target audience. Email sales@safm.co.za. SAFM, the influencer you can trust.
Conversations that you connect with and react to. SAFM.
This week, today, Fridays, 6 to 7 p.m.
Welcome back to This Week Today. My name is Oliver Dickson, and I'm with you up until the top of the hour, 7 p.m. You are listening to the debut episode of This Week Today here on SAFM, a show that's brand new, just started today. And if you're just joining us, a recap of what the show is about. We're a weekly show that will unpack some of the biggest issues of the week and asking the question, what does this all mean? How does it influence and shape our existence politically, economically, and socially going forward? You can engage with us on Twitter. It is at SAFM Radio, or you can simply tweet me at Oliver_speaking. And Facebook, it's Oliver Dickson. And we'll engage some of your comments over there and take the conversation further. We're about to have a conversation about South Africa's inaction and vague and almost ambiguous and sometimes misleading position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It obviously has sent economic ripple effects throughout the world, with the price of oil skyrocketing, and the inflationary impact thereof is being felt very, very, very intimately by all of us. The price of petrol pushes up the price of, food, the price of everything else, it outpaces our ability to increase salaries, especially in an economy that is still in the infancy of its pre-pandemic recovery program. So the question then is, are our politicians, especially our president, our minister of finance, and our minister of mineral resources, are they gambling with our economic future by not being clear about how they stand on the Russia matter, especially trading with Russia? The whole world over has sanctioned Russia. But Russia's trade partners in BRICS are still doing business with Russia. China is still doing business with Russia. India bought cheap oil from Russia. And when President Ramaphosa was asked if he would buy cheap oil from Russia, he said, well, we will make decisions that's in the best interest of our country. He was asked that question in Dubai by Newsroom Africa anchor Ayanda Nyati. And that question for me would have made me nervous if I ran a business or if I had an investment portfolio tied to the AGOA trade agreement or tied to the EU trade agreement with South Africa, because it is a trade agreement with preferential trade terms. And it may well be the case that the EU feels that South Africa is boycotting Russia and they don't want to do business with countries that are on the wrong side of a war. It may well be the case that the White House makes the same decision. And so the question is, does that pose an economic risk to us? And to have this conversation with me is Tembisa Fakude, who is a political commentator but holds a master's degree in politics, and he's here to speak to us specifically about the politics of that. Tembisa is also a senior researcher and looks intimately at these sort of matters. Tembisa, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Let's start there. Does this political exposure pose a economic threat to us, an economic risk, especially when it comes to those diplomatic relations that we have with the EU and America, with the global north, really?
Yes, it is going to impact on our economic stability. It has already impacted on our prices of food. Yesterday, there was an interesting report on BBC regarding the price of wheat, particularly in Kenya. So South Africa is definitely going to be impacted, particularly on matters of energy, fuel and gas. Prices are going to be impacted, and that will also basically trickle down into in the high inflation, and also the price of food are going to impact on our people in this country, besides just general politics, which I think we've been fumbling in terms of addressing them. But economically, we are going to start feeling the pinch very soon.
If Cyril Ramaphosa decides to buy cheap oil from Russia the same way India did, will that make us any more economically precarious than we are, or will it really benefit us because the price of oil will come down and the price of petrol will come down as a result of that? What's the opportunity cost there and the trade-off?
Well, the thing is, he can decide to do so, but the Americans and the European Union are very clear in terms of people assisting Russia in this regard. So South Africa doesn't want to dig in its heels and go deeper into the trouble of associating itself and continuing this relationship with Russia, because it might just impact on future economic aid, future economic cooperation with Europe and the US. So I think Cyril Ramaphosa and his government will be very careful on how it deals with Russia. Yes, of course, the Russia now is in need of friends and is in need of new clients, and they might just look at South Africa being part of BRICS. But I'm not quite sure whether Cyril Ramaphosa will fall into the trap of going closer in relations with Russia, because as we have seen, what has happened currently when the United States and the European Union decided to impose sanctions, Russia is already feeling the pinch. Yesterday it announced that it's going to be demanding all those that are buying energy resource from that country to be paying in rubles, which is in dire straits at the moment. So yeah, I think Cyril will be quite careful of not going into the position where he moves closer into Russia.
But when he was asked the question, will you buy cheap oil, he didn't have an outright no. He had an answer leaning very heavily towards we may just well do that, because his answer was verbatim, we will make decisions that's in the best interest of our country. And that moral cop-out for me seems to signal that he's interested in buying cheap oil. And I'm obviously speculating here, but when politicians don't give us answers, they leave us nothing but options to speculate, right? How closely do you think the West and the global North will be watching South Africa's reaction here, specifically given that we still have egg in our face from a failed sponsor at the United Nations General Assembly when it came to the condemnation of Russia, and we're still dealing with the diplomatic fallout thereof. But two, and importantly, do you think that there will be early triggers for opting out of those preferential trade agreements between, say, the EU, which is 18.7 billion US dollars worth of trade for South Africa, and the United States of America, which accounts for 13 billion US dollars of trade with South Africa.
Well, Cyril Ramaphosa will never dare offend the European Union, nor will he offend Britain or the United States. But besides, it will be extremely foolhardy for anyone to be associating with Russia at the moment, given that the entire Western world, which is, by the way, two of the most powerful parts of the world, have decided to take the position they've taken against Russia. It will be irresponsible, I may add, if any government at this point will openly, notwithstanding, by the way, the size of South African economy, I'm not quite sure whether we can really afford to have a standpoint, an independent position regarding our stance towards Russia. At some point, we have to take a position, and that position will be by and large influenced by the economic muscle and power of the European Union and the United States. But for us to go and stand firm in terms of standing with Russia, I think it would be very irresponsible.
You know, after this, I want us to have a conversation very importantly about why the ANC and by logical extension, the South African government seems to have Russian nostalgia, or at least struggle nostalgia related to Russia, and whether or not we owe allegiance to countries and perpetual lifetime allegiance to countries that helped us during the struggle, even if it comes at a cost to ourselves and is morally bankrupt. I want to ask you that question on the other side of this. Let's take a quick break.
Hi, my name is Khomotso Keiji Mweketsi, your host for Seasons, every Saturday and Sunday between 10 and 1. You will hear me playing this. And if you love smooth jazz or all kinds of jazzy sounds, you can hear me do this. Seasons every Saturday and Sunday between 10 and 1.
This week, today with Oliver Dickson.
You are listening to the debut episode of Today This Week, Today with Oliver Dickson. My name is Oliver Dickson, and I hope to be in your company every Friday successfully between 6 and 7, where you and I unpack very slowly and with a fine-tooth comb the biggest issues of the week and ask the question, what does this all mean? And get to the bottom of the impact these stories will have on our political future, economic future, and our social future as citizens and as participants in the global economy, the global body politic, and our geopolitical existence. And that's exactly the question, the conversation we're having right now with Senior Research Fellow at EFRA SAID, that is Thembisa Fakude. Thembisa, why does the ANC hold on to the nostalgia of the lending hand we got from what seemed to be primarily communist states back then, right? Cuba, Russia, China. Are those relationships outdated?
Well, they're not outdated because we still have a lot of ANC leaders who are still active, and some of them in cabinet, and many of them are in parliament, who were trained and sponsored by Russia over the years. So it's going to be very difficult for us to expect them to renounce those relationships. That's the first point. The other point is we're part of BRICS, and our past immediate president, Jacob Zuma, was very close. In fact, we are told that he speaks fluent Russian. So he was very close to Putin. The current deputy president is proud to tell us that he is attended in terms of his health by Russian doctors, and we know that he disappeared for some time during COVID to Russia to look at his health. So there is that very strong relationship between ourselves and Russia, not only the past relationship that the ANC enjoyed, but you have the ongoing relationships that most members of parliament still enjoy with Russia. And so that's the key. But the other thing is we have a president who was neither arrested nor exiled. And that creates another problem, because it means, therefore, is beholden to his colleagues and comrades in terms of Russian politics and foreign relations. When it comes
so that's an interesting point to raise, because it's a dynamic that I didn't think of. that Cyril Ramaphosa would want to buy credibility from his comrades in the ANC, in particular because he may have some sort of, guilt about not having been an exiled president, like all our former presidents. And never having really been arrested except for that one time, and then he got released, which became controversial between him and Tera Likota in Parliament 2 years ago. To that effect, do you think that Ramaphosa really is taking that position because he knows that's what is in the best interest of his political future factionally within the ANC?
Very, very much so. I mean, I know stories of how he used to be humiliated by some of his comrades, deliberately, by the way, at meetings when they start talking about their days in exile. And some will be talking about the days in Robben Island, and he had nothing to contribute. And it was meant to sideline. So he wants to be accepted as a leader. We know people like Joe Modise, for example, will come and they used to brag about how it was in Moscow and how they used to do certain things. I mean, you can imagine being Cyril Ramaphosa in that company, having to sit quietly in the corner and with nothing to say. So the best he can do now is to try and buy, in the township, you say, buy Skellum, and get more accepted in terms of his comrades to say, well, at least I'm also one of you. Because the majority of them, people like Lindiwe Zulu, for example, are very proud cadres who tell you that they were trained in Russia. Tokyo Sikwale the other day was talking about his days in exile. And in fact, he spent a lot of time in Kyiv. So the majority of the ANC who are still active are former Russian exiled politicians, and I think Cyril Ramaphosa, that is very careful not to further alienate and isolate himself.
Would he have made a different decision about this, or would the country's response have been different if he was in his second term, if he were to be a second-term president?
I think so. I think if he was a second-term president, he would have made a different decision. But again, what continues to be a problem is the fact that we're part of BRICS and continue to be part of BRICS, notwithstanding our size. But if you look at who's in BRICS at the moment, and that has created a problem, because at some point we'll have to make a decision. We cannot continue being associated with this group of, I would like to call them gangsters, whether it's Vladimir Putin, it's Modi of India, who's an ultra-nationalist, Bolsonaro of Brazil, who's got some strange politics, Xi Jinping of China, who continues to oppress people in Taiwan and in Hong Kong. So South Africa is the only country that's in there at the moment, and I think that continuance is definitely denting our brand South Africa.
Yeah, because he's really associated with the right-wing cabal of the world, effectively. Donald Trump was a big fan of Bolsonaro. Donald Trump was very lenient towards Trump. Bolsonaro bowed before Xi Jinping. And the rest of the global north really looked at that and like, with the plausible exclusion of Boris Johnson, would be saying things like, but is this in the best interest of, the global liberal movement? And it seems not to be the case. Does our non-liberal association pose any sort of diplomatic threats, not just financially, but also just like, if we were to bid for another World Cup, for instance, right? If we were to bid for a big, event in the world, will that count for something?
No, I think so. But you must remember there's two different issues here. You have a president who is a liberal. In all appearances, at some point he was a chairperson of McDonald's, and all that's American. So he's quite liberal. But at the same time, he surrounded himself with people who are still associated with the socialist communist politics of both Russia and China. So he's got no choice at the moment. So we hope that the second term will free him a bit and he can start exercising politics and show independence in terms of his politics. But right now, ANC leads by consensus, unfortunately.
Yeah.
There's something called the National Executive Committee.
Just in 30 seconds, I want you to answer this for me. If you were to advise Ramaphosa tomorrow, let's say he's got the G8 meeting coming up and he's in the company of Trudeau, Biden and Johnson, what does he say to them to redeem South Africa's inaction and moral cowardice when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
I think he points them to the NEC of the ANC, and he points them to the history, and he tells them about him not being arrested and ever being in exile, and he tells them that if you look at the past president of the ANC, from Nelson Mandela to Kgalema Motlanthe, all of them were either in Robben Island or were exiled, and Cyril Ramaphosa is the only homegrown president that we have. And as a result, his hands are tied.
Thank you so much for your time, Thembi Safakudi. Really, really do appreciate it. Fantastic insights over there. And just like that, we've come to the end of the first episode, first show, whatever you want to call it, of This Week Today with me, Oliver Dickson. It's been a pleasure being in your company. And I'm back next week, and we'll have the same conversation around the most topical issues of the week and ask the fundamental question: what does this all mean to us? How does it shape our future? And how does it inform how we should be making decisions as citizens, as individuals, as economic participants, as social beings, or whatever we consider ourselves in that moment? Coming up right now is the news with Greg House.
Independent and impartial. This is SAFM News.
Thank you, Oliver, and a warm welcome to you. In this news update, SARS collects more than 1 trillion rand and Public Protector goes to court over parliamentary probe. Good evening. SARS has announced that it's collected just over 1.5 trillion rand for the 2021-2022 financial year. This resulted in 314 billion rand in additional revenue compared to what was projected in the previous financial year. The Revenue Services Commissioner, Edward Kieswetter, addressed a media briefing in Pretoria.
The significant contributors in this regard: PIT was net up by 67.3 billion, or 13.8%, to 555.8 billion rand. Corporate income taxes net up by 119.2 billion, or 58.3%, to 300.